In 2024, identity governance and administration, or IGA, has become essential for Asian enterprises navigating digital transformation. Now, proper IGA enables businesses to ensure the right people have the right level of access to the right resources, thereby mitigating risk of data breaches, compliance violations, and insider threats. The responsibility falls on CIOs to integrate IGA solutions, providing centralized visibility and control, while CISOs must ensure these systems enforce robust security policies and protect against identity-related attacks. Collaboration between CIOs and CISOs is critical to developing a comprehensive IGA strategy that addresses both operational efficiency and cybersecurity. We recently spoke to Chern-Yue Boey, Senior Vice President for Asia Pacific at SailPoint, for his take on utilizing IGA to enhance identity management.
IGA basically is identity governance and administration, and that's how it kind of started, exactly what it means, right? It was used as a solution to be able to provide reporting so that they can administer a lot of compliance and governance policy. And also at the same time, administration also means that they are used to kind of like, provision accounts, right? Administration of account of the employees within the organization. So that's how it got started, right? Basically a more back office function. But over time, it has evolved to be the center of, basically identity security. And that's really because at the end of the day, if you think about how identity security have changed, it's actually evolved quite a fair bit from a very perimeter kind of a security to now also to be identity related, right? And that's really because of the basis that if you look at 85% of the breach in the world are identity related. And this is from a report from IDSA, right? So because of that, there's a need, therefore, to kind of look and make sure that from a cybersecurity perspective, the principle of least privilege access is used as a basis to deploy what we call zero trust security architecture. And therefore, IGA, as you know it, has evolved and become more and more centered into the whole identity security realm. And that's how, the reason why it becomes the core of it all is really because it sits at the intersection to kind of understand identity with context to every aspect of identity security, right? You have access management, you have also privileged access management, and in the future, you're potentially going to have identity risks and so on and so forth. It all has to converge at the intersection where IGA then provides that, basically a platform and an insight that glues everything together. IGA brings a very critical part to overall identity security. It is actually the basis and foundation for people to understand, enterprises to understand who have access to what at scale. Right? If you think about identity context in everything that is digital within an enterprise is actually very, very important, right? And how do you know somebody who's in there, or an identity, be it human and non-human, have access to the only enough applications, only enough privileges to do their work, no more, no less? Because over privileges means that the identity then therefore can abuse it. Underprivileged will also means that they can't do their work properly, right? Just enough access will be important. So I think that's one of the key things that the modern identity security solutions that like SailPoint actually does. It provides that insight. It allows it to actually then solve this what we call identity big data problem, right? Because if you think about it, it's ultimately about giving insight to the relationship between an identity to all the resources out there within the environment. And how do you do that when you have a huge relationship permutation that can happen within identity based on the number of applications you have, based on the number of privileged access you have, and right down to into the future and currently as well, how much data they can access, structured and unstructured, right? So that's the big part about what a modern identity IGA brings. And we tend to kind of interchangeably use identity security and IGA because it really is the core of identity security, right? So that's kind of where IGA brings, the modern identity security brings to the table. So IGA used to, in the original form, very much focus on what we call productivity focus, efficiency and productivity focus. You remember I talked about earlier that it's really about providing reporting for governance, administrating a account. That's kind of how it started, right? And that was the old IGA. And as you talk about, it kind of evolved into the center of identity security. It's driven a lot by the fact that digital transformation has accelerated in a big way, and security transformation hasn't caught up with digital transformation. And now we're going through that age right now where that security transformation is happening, people are moving into zero trust, and you will see that IGA now taking a more central role in identity security. And that evolution itself is important because if you think about the breach that's happened, while the outside-in threat is huge, the inside out is where most of the threat happens. 80% of the breach has happened from the inside out, right? And so the IGA has evolved to take care of that very much, to become the core of identity security. So there are also a few evolution that has been driven by the trend that's happening in the market. There's a few key things that, for example, it used to be only about employee, human employee in the organization, about managing that identity access. But if you think about it now that, as digital transformation become more pervasive, you're going to see that the type of identity has gone from human, non-human, and non-human includes things like service account, and also bots, right? And it also covers employee and non-employee, because a lot of this whole, outsourcing of resources is beginning to take place in a big way. And if you look at some of the major notable breach in the market, a lot of it comes from third party as well. So the third party identity becomes a critical part to be managed overall, right? We talked about service account earlier, right? It's interesting. Recently, if you probably heard, in Singapore, MOE, there was a breach in the app's called Mobile Guardian. And it was reported in Straits Times that it says that the root of it is because somebody unauthorized access into what they call a support account. And that's really service account, right? So the problem is that how do you manage to make sure that when somebody has moved on to a job or leave the organization, that you turn off that access? So this thing becomes very big. So over time, the size and scale of what needs to happen will drive the changes in the IGA in itself, right, into something that's very important, that has to be very much automated, driven by AI to help you find the needle in the haystack. We talk about beyond human capacity, right? So you talk about, just for example, somebody like size of SailPoint, there is about a 1 trillion of permutation of relationship that needs to be managed. You can't manage it with human, right? So I think that the evolution as well is to drive the identity security more and more to be assisted by AI engine. You also see some other trend that's coming in that is actually driving some further evolution. For example, people are now talking about dynamic access control, right? Identity cannot be just static. It cannot be just, for example, Alan, you come in here, you on this role that you have this access. But what if you are given a special project? How do we give you the access only for that purpose and that time duration? The dynamic access control is going to be very, very important overall. Another example as well, not so much maybe in Singapore, but if you look at other places where the border control, when you fly into the airport, the border control personnel, they may be the guy who be sitting behind the desk stamping a passport, but they don't do that all day. They could also be the guy who carry guns and patrol the airport, right? But when they are changing their role for the day, you should be giving them different access, right, as a way to control this. And those are dynamic access control that is going to drive the evolution we will see in identity security. Now, what is very, very important is this, as this evolves, and this is identity security today, but some of the trends we're sharing is going to drive more and more towards what we call adaptive identity, right? And adaptive identity is really about how do you drive from a role-based access to a policy-based access in a dynamic sense. So all the stuff I talk about, how contextually giving by policy and access and taking by policy away the access in the context of the identity and the job they got to perform, I think you're going to see that evolving towards adaptive identity. And that's where you see some of these things starting to kind of come into the modern identity security platform. Identity security is not a project, it's actually a program. And it's a journey and it's a program. And because it's a program, is actually far-reaching within an organization, which means there are going to be multiple stakeholders in an organization, right? So in order to then be successful, as you start to drive thinking about integration, the program manager needs to understand that how do you make sure there's open communications with the different stakeholders, getting them on board on this, right? But follow on from there is that also how do you show quick wins, right? How do you ensure that the most important applications and resources are protected? So from that perspective, one of the key focus from this, the owner of this program would be that how do you drive phase integration? That means by phases, you integrate the applications and processes in your organization. You can't boil the ocean because there's a lot to kind of do, a lot to kind of go through. But how do you drive a prioritized phase implementation, right? So I think that's the first thing you got to think about. And therefore, following on from that point, I think what is important for many program owner, identity program owner, is to think about how do you invest in a platform that allows you to do some level of automatic discovery of the application in your environment, right? So that you can then take those data and then help to understand and figure out what the priority and the phasing you got to do, right? So, that's going to be very important. That's why we talked about earlier some of the evolution of identity security and IGA platform is that it's moving more and more towards, a unified platform with an AI-driven and powered platform to provide those kind of discovery. I think that's very important, right? The second thing that program owner need to think about is speed of integration, right? How do you reduces the effort and time to onboard your program and your application and identity onto the platform? Because the more you onboard it, the more you have insight to it, the more you can manage it, it reduces the risk, right? Now, when you look at then how fast then can you onboard your applications onto your identity security platform? Now, think about it for a moment, right? If your onboarding efforts on the average cost you $10,000 for every application on board, and an organization 2,000 application, it's not uncommon. You just imagine the cost of doing that onboarding, right? So it's to their benefit to think about this as they think about starting the program, the technology they're going to be using. How do you pick something that allows you to have a easier and fastest time to value, right? And that to me is the second consideration they need to have. And it really boils down to thinking about it in a couple of things. How do you make sure that from your architecture perspective and the selection of technology, that you are actually picking something that allows you ready connectors that connect to many applications out there in the market. That's going to be very important because what you don't want to do is to have to heavily customize the connection. First, it costs money, hard to maintain, and it becomes very hard, cost prohibitive, right? So how do you have out-of-box connector that focus on configuration rather than customization? So you need to find something a platform that allows you to have that rich number of ready connector. The second thing you got to think about as well is that how do you drive AI-assisted smart onboarding, right? Because you think about it, today when you onboard an application, there's a lot of manual work. You got to figure out this application, you got to configure, you put on so forth, what you need to put in there, the parameter, and the configuration you put on it. But what if you can reduce the effort tremendously by using AI to assist you to do that, right? Just imagine, right? We talk about $10,000 per application, 2,000 applications, that's 20 million over a period of years, right? But if you can reduce that by half, imagine the amount of cost you can save just trying to get yourself protected, right? So I think those are the second thing, speed of integration is important. And the third thing will really be about single source of truth, right? We talked about just now IGA as it evolved in identity security, the core identity security. It's an intersection of many things within identity security, right? You have access management, you have privilege. Next time in the future, you have ITDR, identity threat detection and remediation. How do you have a single source of truth to kind of say that, hey, the identity context from this single source is trustworthy, is comprehensive, and I can see in a single pane of glass, right? And therefore, if you start thinking about it, it is therefore important to think about it from a perspective of how do you pick a technology that gives you a single unified platform with a single data model and basically common services that other pieces and elements within identity security can use to actually then do their job, as an example, privilege account management PAM, right? It's a big thing. But how do you ensure that when people who have access to the PAM, when they change job and no longer should have access to the PAM, they actually are governed and managed and changed in the privilege? If you don't have an IGA, a unified platform that gives you a single source of truth, you'll never be received because you're managing another island away from IGA and everything else. So the unified platform becomes a very important piece of the puzzle to give you that single source of truth. So that's the third thing you gotta think about. The last advice I would give to CISO and CIO as well, and program owner for identity, is that as you start to go through on this thing to integrate the processes and your application, it's important to think about how in the process and the journey you streamline your process. There's a saying in Austin, and because we are Austin-based headquarter company, there's a saying in Austin that says, don't pave the cow path. What it means is, it's very interesting because it means that a cow walks through the field in a certain pattern, right? Over time it becomes kind of barren, and then when they start to build a path, people start to pave the path. But it goes this way when it could go straight, right? And that's what it means, that don't pave the cow path. So if an identity program owner is trying to roll this out, then think about ways to streamline it. You don't have to do like-for-like replacement, because then you would have missed out quite a fair bit of the value of the integration. So those are a few things I would advise to all the CISO and CIO as they start on this journey. Let's take a step back and look at this, right? I mean, the evolution in cybersecurity and regulation has been going at a breakneck speed, right? You do see that a lot, right? You can see some of the trends that's coming down, but you can also not see what's going to come in the future, right? So I think there's a bit of that going on. But if you take a step back and look at what's happening right now from the trend perspective that drives some of the evolution, one is that I think the number of identity in itself is going to be increasing in a very, very large number, right? If you look at, there is a study that says that it's about 10% expected increase over the next couple of years on number of identity. So for organization that, for example, has 100,000 identity, global organization, 10% is a huge increase on number of identity, right? So how do you look at that and figure out what kind of framework to address that? I think that's going to be important. Number two is that the type of identity also will expand tremendously. In the past, it used to be only about human employee. Now it also includes human third-party non-employees. And then you talk about also non-human, like bots, service account, IoT, and all these things. It's just going to compound to the whole complexity of how do you manage this whole identity and govern them. I think it's going to be very, very important. Then the second trend you're going to see as well is that there is really an increase on the need to look at data governance. And this is driven quite a fair bit by data privacy regulation that you see happening in many of the markets, right? You see that, for example, it's not good enough just to kind of know that a person have access to the system, but also the data you have access to. How do you know that he should have a read and write access or only read only? Right? I think those kind of things become very important, and especially now if you think about the way digital transformation is driven, and there is really 80% of the data you have to govern is actually unstructured. That complicates the matter in a very, very big way, right? And if just an example, right? Let's take, for sake of discussion, if you have today access to SharePoint, PowerPoint, for example, for the role that you have, but let's say tomorrow you change role, would you still be able to access to the SharePoint data? You probably have to govern that, right? I mean, this is where the trends are coming. And that's because it ties back to a lot of GDPR, a lot of local data privacy stuff that people need to kind of be a bit more careful how you govern it. The few other trends that you would see as well is that there is also an increased interest to understand what's the identity risk scoring. So as an identity in your environment, in the job you do, in the access you currently have, and the way you behave within your organization, what's your identity score? Is it high risk, low risk? Right? Those are trends that's coming because people want to know. And this is all part of what I said earlier, in adaptive identity, which is kind of the phase we're going to get into. This becomes a very important thing, right? Because when you are about to give an identity a certain privileges and access, you want to see from a risk scoring perspective, before you give it that access, are they okay from a risk scoring perspective? And if you give that access to him, will that blows the risk scoring, and therefore it becomes very risky, right? So I mean, that's the trend, right? People are looking at it, and you think about it, ITDR is a big hot topic right now, but it wasn't 2 years ago. And that's because the evolution has taken place so fast, right? And it's still very important, therefore, from somebody who is going on this journey and going to look at how do you put in the architecture and framework to address this. One of the key things you got to think about is how do you make sure that you have a unified platform that allows you to address your requirement today, serve its purpose, cater for the upcoming trend, and also be able to be future-proof in the future, because you do know what's going to come, right? ITDR was a good example over there. And if you think about it, again, I re-emphasize this, solving this is really trying to solve for an identity big data problem, right? So thinking about the framework where you have a unified platform with a single data model, single source of truth, powered by AI to help you find that needle in the haystack, right? And then be able to provide the common services to all those other things that hangs off this platform becomes very important, because it gives you first single source of truth, and second of all, it gives you a single pane of glass to look at your identity context in your environment, which is very, very important. If you're powered by AI, it helps you to continuous monitoring of this environment, event trigger orchestration when it comes out, right? So say, for example, somebody changed job, because of the event, it triggers off a whole workflow to help you then reassess what that person should be given access to. Right? And that's a very important point, right? Because if you think about it, the move to adaptive identity means that everything should be a lot more dynamic. The old thinking of saying that, the old thinking of IGA is that, hey, if I put certain privileges to an identity, I should go back every 6 months to check if he should still have that identity. But then the question is that what happens if that person shouldn't have the identity before the 6 months is up and they are already exposed? And that's one problem. The second problem you have that every 6 months you go out there in bank, for example, the FSI, the managers get to certify and say, yeah, this person that in my organization have this access and he's certified to have it. After a while, people just find it very difficult and just rubber stamp it, right? So rather than doing that, is there a way to then put in a architecture that allows this thing to be more triggered by event, be able to use AI and technology and a platform that tells you if there's an outlier in here, this person in this role, in compared to the peer, shouldn't have this access. Can you please take a look at that and trigger that as a certification process vis-a-vis, hey, every 6 months, throw a whole bunch of lists in front of managers and they just rubber stamp it, right? So if people think about this thing, it's really about the framework that support what's to come. And that's going to be, I think, very, very heavily dependent on building a unified platform that does what it can do today and also in cater for the future.